Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
For the last lecture, we talked about these two strands of reading the media, like depending on which position you are taking, is you are either a techno-determinist or a social or cultural determinist. From our last lecture, what we learned is about these two strands, like technological or techno-determinism and social and cultural determinism. So, we talked about determinism and based on and to quickly recap, based on one's position, we either call it technological determinism or social determinism. So, quickly I am recapping, like a technological determinist is one believes that a society's technology drives the development of its social structure and cultural values. So, it is the technology that drives the social forces, the social or the culture ahead of technology. Yeah, so we talked about this in the last lecture, but let me tell you. So, this has got to do with the prioritization, whether you are either prioritizing technology over society or society over technology. So, this is as we have seen for our last lecture, this is what we call like the deterministic Now, the problem with deterministic approach is it puts either society or technology on top of the other. So, it prioritizes one over the other. So, it does not take care of the fact that both technology and culture or society for that matter are two faces of the same coin. So, it either prioritizes technology over society or society over technology. So, however, in view of these two deterministic approaches, so in the next course of the lecture, in this session we are trying to problematize the deterministic approaches, which is to say determinism as a mode of inquiry. However, like in view of these deterministic approaches, Raymond Williams, who, if you recall, we have invoked Raymond Williams, where we discussed about in the very beginning of the lectures, like we talked about Raymond Williams's concept of media from his keywords. So, I am going to read out a Raymond Williams quotation here, which has got to do with this approach of determinism. So, Raymond Williams says, and I read the quote: "The technical sense of medium, something with its own specific and determining properties, has in practice been compatible with a social sense of media, in which the practices and institutions are seen as agencies for quite other than their primary purposes." So, this is from his keywords, his entry on media. I would ask you to take a look at how he uses the plural and the singular form, the medium and the media. I will read it out again: "The technical sense of medium, as which is in the singular, as something with its own specific and determining properties, has in practice been compatible with a social sense of media." So, the technical sense of medium Yes, so these are the two indicators that Raymond Williams is drawing our attention to, like the technical sense of the medium, and if you recall what we have been discussing so far, like the materiality or the technology as an artifact, the materiality of the technology, like the which is what Raymond Williams refers to as the technical sense of the media, like the technical know-hows, the infrastructure, the technological apparatus. So, this is the technical sense of media, and the social sense of media, if you recall your base superstructure model and all of that, like which has got to do with ideology, politics, political intent, and the biases of the media that we have been discussing. So, this is the social sense of the media. So, what Raymond Williams is saying, that the technical sense of medium as something with its own specific and determining properties. The word determining is very important here, in the sense that if you now recall the deterministic approaches, the techno-determinist and the social determinist approaches, like as I said, like scholars, they usually prioritize one over the other, technology, either technology or the social. So, the medium with its determining properties has in practice been compatible with a social sense of media. So, what Raymond Williams is trying to hint at is how the technical sense and the social sense of media are imbricated, they speak to each other, and they are, as Raymond Williams says, in practice been compatible with each other. So, this notion of compatibility here, like the synergy, the compatibility here is very important. So, the technical sense has in practice been compatible with a social sense, in which the practices and institutions are seen as agencies for quite other than their primary purposes. So, like the primary purpose, as we have talked about, for example, we invoked the case of cinema. The primary purpose of cinema is entertainment, so to say, but then cinema also has its ideological bias. Cinema, in as much as any piece of technology, would have its political intent, ideological intent, ideological biases, and so on and so forth. So, what Raymond Williams again is trying to suggest is like the synergy and the compatibility between the technical sense and the social sense. Further illustrate like the symbiotic relation, if we may call it, the synergy clearer, like think for example, the Google Maps, like the Google Map for example, relies on like a bunch of technologies, say for example, the internet, the mobile phone or the gadget that you are accessing the map from, and a host of other technological pieces. But then once we check the traffic on the Google Map, that also influences on how we navigate our way in the city. I will quickly give you a few examples here, so that you could relate to this synergy or this relation of compatibility what Raymond Williams suggests. We can relate to this better. Say for example, the Google Map number 2 . So, I will give you 3 examples that will illustrate this compatibility that Raymond Williams is trying to draw our attention to. If you think of the Google Map, it involves technical devices. The map, the map is accessed through certain devices, the phone, the computer, the laptop, so on and so forth. You need internet and so on. So, when we access the map on our phone, it also influences our sense of direction, our navigation, and the way we choose to navigate. So, technical. Yes, if you think of a more simple example, like the traffic signal, the traffic light. People make traffic lights, it involves iron poles, it involves electricity, it involves engineering mechanism, so to say, that renders possible the installation of traffic lights on the street. But then when we drive and we read the signals red, yellow, green and so on the traffic light, the lights control our movement. So, in other words, the lights control us, the traffic lights control us. So, we make the traffic lights and then the lights control us. If you think of the third example, the selfie as an example, if you could consider the technical elements that are prerequisite for taking a selfie, you need a mobile phone, and it is not just a mobile phone, you need a certain kinds of mobile phones are better suited for taking selfies. For example, the phone with a front camera and so on and so forth. So, there are certain technological devices which are better suited for taking selfies, but then once you start taking selfies, you start posing for the selfies. The selfies as an artifact, the selfie as an artifact also influences you to pose in a certain way, so that the selfies would look good and so on and so forth. If you think of the social networking platform Instagram, like with the new millennials, a survey shows that Instagram as a social networking site among the millennials, it is growing popular even compared to Facebook. So, if you think of Instagram as a platform which is largely sourced by selfies, like we post most people would post most of their selfies on Instagram. So, Instagram as a platform then again is influenced by the selfie as an artifact. So, what these three examples point to us, I mean these are examples of compatibility between the social and technical. So, these three examples that we have just invoked, they point to the compatibility that Raymond Williams talks about, and in this context let us also be attentive to the fact that in the determinist approach, be it the techno-determinist approach or the social or cultural determinist approach, like the question of the approach of determinism, so to say, takes the agency of. So, if you are a technological determinist, you take the agency of the social or the cultural, like as I said, as we have been discussing, the technological determinist does not understand the nuances of the culture or the society. He or she prioritizes technology over society, and in doing so she takes the agency, the subjectivity of society or culture. And contrary wise, like a social or cultural determinist, she takes the agency of technology. What Raymond Williams is doing here, and will taking cues from Raymond Williams, will get to another media theorist called Marshall McLuhan. But before we get into this, I mean crux of the Raymond Williams quotation that we just discussed is the fact that it retrieves the subjectivity, it retrieves the question of agency, and it places the question of agency in context. So, when Raymond Williams talks about compatibility, he is in a way reviving the question of agency. So, in other words, when the discussion flows into issues of new media and the biases of new media, so it is kind of what Raymond Williams says by compatibility is more of a kind of a complementary approach that Raymond Williams is taking, and in invoking Raymond Williams, what we are trying to suggest here is we cannot think of any technological artifact without ideology, in as much as we cannot think of any ideological bias immanent in a certain piece of technology without considering the materiality of that piece of technology. So, this is the compatibility, this is the complementarity we are trying to get at. So, from here we are going to mount our discussion onto issues of bias, and we will look into how this compatibility or the complementarity or this symbiotic relation between the social and the technical leads to renders certain media biased. First, consider the example of the electric telegraph. So, the electric telegraph changed our outlook concerning the association between communication and transportation. So, if you look into like early 20th century, the electric telegraph like revolutionized how people used to think about communication. So, in fact, the telegraphic messages could exceed, when I say exceed I mean in terms of speed, they could exceed any mode of physical transportation system and could be delivered nearly instantaneously. The telegram could be delivered instantaneously, like it's a matter of like a few, not even few seconds, like it's just instantaneous. So, the electric telegraph did not even require any territorial allocation, and it transcribed sound signals into words, like sound signals were converted into words and people could read those sound signals translated into words. And this, even if you are attentive to it, it did not require any human interface, like it is a, of course, I am not taking the question of agency of here. I mean, there is a human of course there who is sending the telegram, who is like who is coding the telegram to be decoded by another human on the other end. But think of the transportation procedure, the moment a telegram is being sent till the moment a telegram is being received, like this process, which is what I am referring to as transportation. This whole process of transformation does not involve, or did not to be precise, did not involve any human face, or for that matter any human voice. So, it is the nature of the telegraph that was soon to become an important device in favor of building, spreading, propagating the empire, like the colonial empire. So, the telegraph could be used as a highly efficient communication tool for optimal control of the outlying territories, a tool with the help of which it became easier to exercise control and power. So, if you think about the model of the colonization in this context, like if you think of the earlier model, if you think of how colonialism functioned in the earlier model, if you look into the history of British East India Company and the model of colonization that they exercised, like earlier there were government civil servants and government officials who were dispatched from Britain. They would be transported to India and they would exercise territorial control here. So, there were these government officials and civil servants who were physically deployed here in the colony, who were physically deployed to carry out the mission of imperialism, so to say. With the emergence of the telegraph, the requirement for deploying this bunch of officials physically out there in the colony would no longer exist. You no longer, the crown, the empire no longer needed to physically deploy these officials here. Instead, of course, if you look into the history of the Fort William College and so on, like the educational imperatives prevalent in the colonial times, of course, like they were the officials started training the Indians, like what they did in the Fort William College. And even for that matter the early universities, the first universities that were set up, the colonizers considered educating the Indians who would carry out the mission. But this was possible, if you recall, because of certain technological innovations, the telegram being one such innovation. So, the telegraph could be used as a highly efficient communication tool for optimal control of the outlying territories, a tool with the help of which it became easier for the British to exercise their control. Like they could send out information through the telegraphic devices, and they had the Indian officials who were trained here in the institutes like Fort William and such like, they would be able to carry out the mission that the British set ahead. So, naturally, with the shift away from colonialism to imperialism, the telegraph eased the transition from territorial to monopolistic control. So, this is a very important shift here, like the need for territorial control could now largely be exercised, as I am saying, without the officials requiring to be physically deployed, shipped from the UK. This was no longer needed. So, naturally, with the shift from colonialism to imperialism, the telegraph is the transition from territorial to monopolistic control. A form of control like a monopolistic control, unlike territorial control, was founded more upon the technological novelties like the railway, the steam engine, the electric cable, the telegram, and so on and so forth. So, this technological innovations eased this transition that was happening in the 19th century. So, territorial control was giving way to monopolistic control. So, it was more monopolistic control is more kind of an economic control, and if you look into the history of colonization, the British would produce a lot of raw materials here in India, take it back, process it, and ship it back to India. So, this has got nothing to do with controlling a colony territorially, like this was a monopolistic control which was laid out on very economic coordinate. So, this was a form of a direct colonization nevertheless, but it did not require territorializing the colony. As the case of the telegraph illustrates, people design and use certain technologies that end up enhancing, promoting and endorsing certain activities and discouraging some others. We will take a look at map here. I will insert one image here. So, we will take a look at this map of the 20th century submarine cables across the world. Like this is what you see before you is a global map of the traffic of the submarine cables at the turn of the 20th century. So, if you see, this clearly points to the correlation between the submarine cables, the electric cables which were submarine, which were under the sea, which is the submarine cables, the electric cable and the telegram. Like the telegram was reliant upon submarine cables and the electric cables. The telegram as a technological artifact, technological innovation was reliant upon some of these other allied technological devices, the submarine cable, the electric cable and so on and so forth. But if you look at this particular map, which is of the existing submarine cables at the turn of 20th century across the globe, you would see the correlation between the submarine cables, electric cables as a technological artifact and colonialism as an imperial mission. So, you see the high density, the high concentration of cables in the UK and how the cables are emerging from the UK, and you see the network here, like they are emerging from UK and then they are spread across the globe. So, this points, I mean this is not without reason that we get to see this high density, high concentration of cables in the UK, because the Britishers as colonizers would monopolize the technology. They would lay control and power over the technological in order to exercise control over the social, over the culture, which has got to do with colonization and the colonies out there. So, the map here, it is not a map, it is a diagram. So, the diagram here points to how the Britishers in a way monopolized the cable networking system in order to lay their control and claim over the colonies. So, as the case of the telegraph illustrates, people design and use certain technologies. So, the British were using cables as a technology to their own need. They were maneuvering, they were leveraging this technological innovation of the cable in order to cater to their interests. So, technologies can be used in ways, technology can be levered, technology can be leveraged, technology can be maneuvered in order to serve to the interest of who is using it. So, people design and use certain technologies that end up enhancing, promoting and endorsing certain activities and that discourage some others. So, in other words, technology itself is not conceived in vacuum, but it rather involves an interface, like the interface of colonization, the interface of the shift away from territorial to monopolistic control. Like these are social interface upon which, as my example illustrates, this shows that how technology works on certain interface, which is thoroughly biased. Like depending on the interface in which a technology works, it is the nature of the interface in which a technology works that makes the technology biased. Like certain interfaces make certain technologies biased in certain way. So, this is something we are trying to get at, and in the next course of discussion we will come to that, and we will look into how new media, by dint of acting upon certain interfaces, are already biased. And if we consider the example of the telegraph here, the telegraph was not invented, in order to serve the British, in order to serve British colonizations. But once invented, the British took it over, the British leveraged it, the British maneuvered it. They used the piece of technology in a certain way, they maneuvered the technology in a certain way, so as it came of their help. The purpose with which the technology ends up serving might not have been innovated for that, but then there are ways people leverage and maneuver in order to use technology in certain ways. And if you take the example of the television here, and if you go back to the US presidential election in the 1980s, Ronald Reagan, who happens to be the 40th US president, it has now been well established that Reagan, during his presidential contestations, would leverage the television in a certain way that would give him an edge over other candidates. So, if you remember, Ronald Reagan was a television actor, and when he contested presidential election, he was in a better position, he was already privileged, and he was already disposed to using the screen medium, the television as a televisation as a technology. He was in a better position of using it. So, he was well ahead of the other contestations, and his screen persona, so to say. And if you think of the Indian elections in particular, the whole phenomenon of actors contesting elections is reflective of this. Now, if you think of the history of television, the television was not invented to help certain presidential or for that matter political candidates. The television was there because there were other set of technological devices, say for example, the transistor, the speaker, the screen, the picture tube, and so on and so forth, which were already in place, which already preceded the invention of technology. And also there was a social demand for a certain kind of a televised content, like again the technological and the social. So, these two phenomena necessitated television was invented at the time the television was invented. But the television, when it comes to Ronald Reagan, he maneuvered and he leveraged television when he contested the presidential election. So, this is one flag post that I would like to keep it afloat here and draw your attention to the fact technologies, as I said, are not conceived in vacuum, like they involve an interface which determines the bias that some of this technology inherits. So, speaking about the bias of media and communication, will invoke Harold Innis here. So, Harold Innis was a Canadian media scholar, and here is this book published in 1970s called The Bias of Communication, in which he looks into how communication patterns, how communication devices like communication media are biased. So, he examines how and in what sense technologies of communication media are biased, the nature of these biases, and what forms of power they endorse, and what sort of political intent or ideological intent do they exercise. For Harold Innis, he classifies communication media into two kinds, which is the Yes. So, Harold Innis classifies communication media into two kinds, like the time based media and space based media. In other words, according to Harold Innis, biases are of two kinds, time bias and space bias. So, the durability of any empire, and this is Harold Innis, he argues that the durability of any empire and by extension any form of control, like when I say empire, like this discussion comes immediately after I have invoked British colonization and the British imperialism and the British empire, but remember in this context that when I say empire here in the context of biases of communication media and in the context of Harold Innis, like media does not necessarily refer to colonization as empire building, but like there are economic empires, there are monopoly economies which are empires. Say for example, the monopolization of certain economies also work along similar lines of an empire. If you think of Amazon as an online retail platform, it has its own business empire. If you think of Walmart, for example, in the North American context, they have their own business empire, retail empire. So, for Harold Innis, the durability of any empire and by extension any form of control. So, Amazon, Walmart, they exercise control over the retail business industry, over us as buyers. This depends on number one, the temporal duration, by which he means the temporal duration over which, the temporal duration for which one can exercise the control. Number two, spatial expansion upon which one can exercise the control. Let us consider Amazon in this context. Like if you are, so Amazon will be in a better position, will be in a controlling position as a business empire if they, for example, are able to control us for a longer period of time. Like they can sell product and they can influence us, they can impact our choices. They are in the business, like when empires are in the business for longer duration of time. And also spatial expansion, by which it means the territorial expansion upon which certain empires exercise their control. If you think of, if we are considering Amazon here, for example, Amazon does not exist in Thailand, whereas Amazon exists in India. There are certain countries, for example, in Bulgaria, Amazon does not function. So, it depends on like also the territorial expansion. So, the durability of any empire, this is why Harold Innis is arguing, is dependent on these two kinds of control, like the temporal duration and the spatial duration upon spatial duration for control. So, based upon this, he classifies media, as we have seen, as we have already said, into time biased media and space biased media. I will explain explain the nature of the bias. First, time biased media. First, we will talk about the nature of time bias. So, time biased media are media infrastructures or media artifacts which are immobile or less mobile, to be precise, or at least cumbersome to move, because they are heavy. However, they are durable. Think of stone inscriptions. Stone inscriptions, I mean it is obsolete these days, but stone infrastructures, you have to realize, are also pieces of communication devices. Like the stone inscriptions, whatever the stone, whatever was inscribed in the stone was meant for communication. So, the stone, if you see the stone as a piece of communication device, the hieroglyphs, the petroglyphs, stone carvings, etc., or rock climbings, for example, they are immobile, they are cumbersome to move. However, they are very durable. Their durability endorses temporal expansion, while their restricted mobility discourages expansion over space. Like you cannot use hieroglyphs, petroglyphs, stone carvings, rock inscriptions to exercise control over a large area of space. You cannot territorially expand your control by dint of propagating hieroglyphs, petroglyphs and stone inscriptions, because they are limited in their mobility, and they can exercise control only over a restricted topographical territorial region. So, think of the Egyptian or the Babylonian empires in this context. They were highly reliant on hieroglyphs, petroglyphs and so on and so forth. So, you get the sense of the bias here, like if once it is very durable, but you cannot move it, and you cannot territorially expand your control by using materials or using communication media devices which are very heavy to move. So, this is one bias. So, you prioritize time based control, which is like the durability for example, over space based territorial control. So, this is one bias. Next, let us come to space biased media. Space biased media, these are lightweight and easily transportable. They can move large distances in a relatively short time, and if you recall our example of the telegraph, electric cables in this context, and the use of telegrams in this context, but they are less durable. They can travel larger distances in shorter time, but they are less durable. Unlike the time biased media, their portability endorses territorial expansion. Now, this very well relates to the example of the telegram and British colonization that we just now discussed. So, they are not durable, like the electric telegram does not stay for a very long time, but it can traverse a very long distance in a very short time. So, their portability endorses territorial expansion. Think of how the British colonization would territorially expand with the help of the telegram. However, they tend to wear away quickly and therefore discourage temporal expansion. Think of the paper, another example. Think of the paper in this context, or even better example in this context of the new media would be the mobile apps. They only virtually exist. I mean, this is a very interesting example. There is no space, so to say. I mean, the statistics that we get to see on our mobile devices, that certain apps occupy certain spaces, these are virtual space. These are not territorial physical space, so to say, like so much like the KB, MB, GB, the units of spaces that our mobile apps use up, these are virtual spaces to begin with. So, these are lightweight. On top of that, they do not exist territorially, they exist only virtually. For an online shopping platform that promotes mobile apps, say for example, the Amazon app with which we buy things over Amazon, the goal is to exercise capitalistic control over longer duration of time in the era of global capital, when the concept of territorial expansion is just redundant. The Amazon inventory, they do not stock their inventory in retail stores. Amazon would have their own warehouses from where they would ship the products. So, the whole concept of where we had like business empires opening up multiple stores in multiple retail stores, in multiple cities, in multiple locations, Amazon does not go by that policy. So, Amazon would have their own big warehouse from where they would ship their products. So, they do not, for that matter, need any territorial expansion, like they do not need any territorial presence. The mobile app that Amazon has introduced would exercise capitalistic control over a longer duration of time. So, that is their motto, that is their goal in the era of global capital, whereas for Amazon the concept of territorial expansion or territorial presence for that matter is just redundant. So, you can think of the mobile app as a very good example of space based media, like mobile apps, they cannot traverse across space, but they can capture a market which is at a different location through their virtual presence. So, they are space biased media, they do not work in the same way as the time biased media would work. What Harold Innis is suggesting at, like the biases of communication, the biases of certain communication media, the biases being of two kind, time bias and space bias. So, taking cues from Harold Innis's observation here will make our foray into the new media and the kind of bias that the new media characterizes. The new media, like every other piece of technology, like for the series of examples that we have been looking through for the last few sessions, equips us with certain things. The new media lets us do certain things, while it does not allow us to do certain things. It equips us with certain things, while it takes away some others. So, this is the nature of the bias. So, it endorses certain things, it discourages certain things, it lets you do certain things, it forbids you to do certain things. It is normative to use certain technology in certain ways, it is not normative to use certain technologies in certain ways. So, this is the nature of the bias, this is the nature of ideology. So, it makes certain culturally constructed, socially constructed ideological apparatuses, and they make them appear natural. So, this is what we are trying to suggest, and this is what we are trying to make sense of. So, the point therefore is to ask, what does the new media endorse, what does it disapprove of? So, today information and entertainment all converge on the web. Now, if you recall our discussion from media convergence, like when we talked about media convergence, we talked about two kinds of convergence, like economic convergence, where media houses tend to own up more and more platforms of news distribution. That is one way of convergence, in as much as the second way of convergence, which has got to do with everything now converging on the web, everything is now internet based, the TV, the newspaper, everything is converging on the web. So, this convergence is like today information, entertainment all converge on the web, in the way that new media is no longer a medium in the singular. Now, you re-invoke the way we have been when we started discussing, right at the onset, when we started looking into the etymology of the word media, and we played around with the singular form and the plural form of media. When we say medium, medium is something which involves the materiality. So, it is a transit phase. So, the new media, what taking cues from Harold Innis, Raymond Williams and a bunch of other theorists that we have discussed, we are trying to look into new media not necessarily as a medium, not necessarily as a transiting interface, rather it is omnipresence. Like the new media, because of the internet, because of the ubiquity of the internet, the new media is everywhere, with the phone in your pocket, with the Android TV, with the smart TV, with the smart watch, like everything is converging, everything is compliant with the World Wide Web, everything is adherent to the internet, and everything is converging in the form of new media. So, new media is no longer a medium as such. And if you recall, when we discussed the Roman Jakobson model, Stuart Hall model and Ferdinand de Saussure's model, these models were talking about the media as a medium, as in something through which, as an interface through which communication would flow. So, the principal difficulty in thinking about new media is no longer just a medium through which the communication passes, it is no longer just an interface, it is omnipresent, it is ubiquitous. Because of the ubiquity of the internet, the new media is just everywhere, it is omnipresent, it is rather like one's specs, it is rather like one's clothes, as in a part which constitutes oneself. We cannot think of our lives without the internet, without the computer, without the smartphone, or for some it is also, we cannot think of ourselves in entirety as a complete self, unless we are in possession of or in some way or the other related to these new media devices. So, media effects, we are trying to make our foray into McLuhan, Marshall McLuhan, who again is another Canadian media theorist, and together with Harold Innis and some other scholars who were based at the University of Toronto at that point of time. There was a school of media theorists, which you can also look it up if you are curious, like they were known as the Toronto School, the Toronto School of Media Theorists. So, Marshall McLuhan and Harold Innis were they got along well with each other, and with a bunch of other theorists, they came to be known as the Toronto School. Marshall McLuhan talks about the effects, sensory effects of media, and this precisely follows from here, the way the new media is convergent of all other platforms, of all other media forms, and the omnipresence of the new media, that the new media is a part of me. The new media, we cannot think of me and new media as two separate entities, like the new media is very much a part of me. Like I cannot live without the phone, I cannot live without the laptop. So, the phone is very much a part of me. So, this sensory effect is what McLuhan refers to as media effects, and in his book Medium is the Message, and mind you, like it is so, this is the title of McLuhan's book, Medium is the Massage. So, upon a preliminary observation, you might find it has been misspelt, it is massage, not message, and McLuhan deliberately misspelt it, so to say. Legend has it that it was a typo in the type setting, like it was initially message, MESSAGE, but then it was a typographical error at the press, where at the printing press with like assortment of the lettering blocks and all of that, it was a typographical error, which during proof checking and all of that, McLuhan realized that massage compared to message in fact makes better sense, given the kind of argumentation that he was going to make in the book, to which will come in a short while. This is the correct title of the book, this is not message, medium is the massage. This has got to do with, McLuhan argues in his book, that media, as we just said, the media is no longer a medium, it is no longer an interface. The media has a kind of, the media, as I said, is a part of me. I cannot think of myself with the media, and in doing so, media exercises a certain kind of sensory control over me. And if you think in this context, like the massage, like the physical massage, a masseur when massages someone, it gives you a sensory effect, like when someone massages someone, it gives you a sensory feel. So, this was the logic, why Marshall McLuhan called his book The Medium is the Massage, keeping in view the sensory effects that media, when it ceases to exist just as an interface or a media, it exerts certain sensory control over us. So, along that lines, media effects, McLuhan argues, and I quote McLuhan here, are new environments, and this is very important, are new environments as imperceptible as water to a fish. So, what McLuhan is arguing here, the media for us is what water to a fish, which is, McLuhan says, subliminal for the most part. So, the media is sublime, it is not apparent, it is just out there. As I said, the internet is ubiquitous, it is just there. And what Donna Boyd, and I think we have mentioned this in the course of our previous lectures, Donna Boyd calls this like the always on. The reference that Donna Boyd, which we might have referred to as passingly in some of the earlier lectures, what Donna Boyd refers to as the always on lifestyle, like people are just always online. The data in your mobile, data in our mobile phone is just always on. So, we do not realize that it is a online persona, there is an online persona to ourself, and that is simultaneous, and we are oblivious of the fact, in as much as that is what McLuhan is referring to as subliminal for the most part. Like when our data on the phone is on, it is subliminal, it is not apparent, we are not attentive to this. So, there is this in Donna Boyd's word, the the always on lifestyle, the always on lifestyle is subliminal to us. So, this is what McLuhan means when he says media effects are new environments as imperceptible as water to a fish, subliminal for the most part, end quote. So, generally speaking, cyberspace is supposed to be techno progressive, avant-garde, progressive looking, like it is very radical in a certain way, if imagined in a certain way. There are problems to it, and I will get into the problems shortly. So, the decentralizing and the globalizing aspect of the new media empower us as citizens, empower us as users of media, and they are considered to be very democratizing. If you think of the Wikipedia example, which I think we have again discussed in the earlier lectures, like one with a legit IP address, one can make any edits, right or wrong for that matter. The editor eventually runs by the edits, but for now, for example, if I wanna even include incorrect information on Wikipedia, there is no way to prevent it. I mean, the editor might run it by eventually and weed out information which are violating, which are transgressing the wiki policy, but then technically speaking, with a legit IP address, I can make any changes whatsoever on a Wikipedia entry. Like this is empowering, like as a recipient of media, as a recipient of media content, I can edit this whole ability to edit and network Wikipedia content in this context is very empowering and democratizing. So, also think of the role of social networking sites in bringing about revolutions in Egypt and Libya, or for that matter the Nirbhaya protest that happened in Delhi in 2012, if I am not mistaken, the Nirbhaya incident in Delhi. So, like the social media posts garner resistance in a certain way, that quote unquote revolutions follow from there. There are, if you think of the hashtag, the phenomenon of the hashtag as a technological innovation, as a technological device, the hashtag as an instrument, the hashtag as an instrument coalesces divergent ideas, divergent subjects across the globe. For example, if you take the example of the Me Too campaign, it is all about a single hashtag that coalesced similar allied forms of ideas into a revolution, into a social movement. So, thinking along these lines, the new media is empowering, democratizing, and very progressive, forward thinking, avant-garde, and so on and so forth. So, notwithstanding its empowering facade, let us also make sense of the affiliations. I mean, this is a very common tendency when you talk about new media, social networking sites. We are pretty overwhelmed by its emancipatory potential, its radical underpinnings, its avant-garde approaches, and so on and so forth. So, notwithstanding this empowering facade, let us also be attentive to the ideological biases that come with the new communication technologies behind its emancipatory rhetoric. McLuhan would be instrumental in this context. We are going to engage the way the new media, in McLuhan's word, massages us, the sensory control that media exercises, the new media exercises on us. If we can make sense of that, that would be instrumental in understanding the bias of the new media. And for this, McLuhan offers us like a model. We will get back to it in a while.